The bronze blade caught the dying light of oil lamps as it moved toward flesh. Not in violence, not in war, but in marriage. The 16-year-old bride didn't flinch. She had been prepared for this moment since childhood, trained to understand that some traditions demanded blood before they demanded love. The room smelled of myrrh and copper, of incense and something older, something that predated the marble temples and the triumphal arches. This was Rome before it learned to hide its darkness behind philosophy and law. This was the ritual they would later bury in the footnotes of history, the ceremony that scholars would dismiss as myth, the wedding rite that revealed how deeply violence was woven into the very fabric of Roman civilization. If you're fascinated by the dark corners of history that textbooks refuse to examine, follow this channel, because what you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. The year was 186 BCE. Though the ritual itself reached back centuries further into the shadowed epoch when Rome was nothing more than mud huts clustered on 7 hills, when the city was ruled by kings who spoke a language half Latin, half Etruscan, who worshipped gods that would later be sanitized, repackaged, made palatable for an empire that fancied itself civilized. The house stood in the Subura district, Rome's writhing, claustrophobic heart where the wealthy dared not walk after sunset. 3 stories of insulae pressed against one another like rotten teeth, and between them, the domus of Marcus Antonius Verus rose like a fortress. Walls of volcanic tufa stone, small windows designed to keep both summer heat and prying eyes at bay. Inside, the atrium was choked with the smoke of ceremonial fires. Torches lined the walls, their flames creating shadows that danced and twisted like living things. The bride's name was Claudia Tertia, 3rd daughter of a family that traced its lineage back to the founding of the Republic, though that lineage had grown thin, anemic with debt and declining influence. She wore the traditional tunica recta, woven on an archaic vertical loom, the fabric coarse against her skin. Her hair had been arranged in the sani crines, 6 braids, separated by the point of a hasta calibaris, a ceremonial spear used only for this purpose, a spear that had, according to tradition, killed a man in battle, already the symbolism of violence. The guests watched from the shadows of the tablinum. 60 faces, maybe 70, their features obscured by smoke and the peculiar quality of lamplight that makes everyone look like ghosts. They had come from across Rome, patricians and wealthy plebeians, political allies and rivals pretending at friendship. They wore their best togas, the wool dyed with Tyrian purple and saffron, colors that cost more than most Romans earned in a lifetime. But their finery couldn't mask the discomfort in their eyes, the way they shifted and whispered, the way their gazes slid away from the ceremony's focal point. The bronze blade. Marcus Antonius Verus stood beside his bride, 24 years old. A military tribune who had distinguished himself in the conquest of Cisalpine Gaul, a man whose face bore a scar from temple to jawbone, a wound from a Gallic longsword that should have killed him, but instead had made him legendary among Rome's warrior class. He was handsome in the brutal way that Romans admired, sharp features, eyes dark as lamp oil, a mouth that seemed incapable of softness. But it was his hands that drew the eye. Large, calloused, marked with the old burns and cuts of a soldier's trade. And in his right hand, he held the blade, the pronuba. The married woman who served as the ceremony's officiant stepped forward. Her name was Julia Sempronia, wife of a consul, mother of 4, a woman whose authority in matters of marriage was unquestioned. She was 60 years old, and her face was a map of Rome's history. Every wrinkle a story, every gray hair earned through decades of navigating the Republic's treacherous social hierarchies. When she spoke, her voice cut through the smoke and silence like a blade through skin. "We gather to witness the confarreatio," she intoned, using the ancient name for Rome's most sacred form of marriage. The joining of 2 families, 2 bloodlines, 2 fates. But before union, there must be severance. Before the new beginning, the old must be cut away. The words were liturgical, worn smooth by repetition across centuries, but their meaning remained sharp. Claudia Tertia stepped forward. She had been taught not to show fear, not to show anything at all. A Roman woman of good family learned early that her face was a mask, her emotions property to be managed, displayed, or hidden as circumstance demanded. But her hands betrayed her, a slight tremor in her fingers, quickly suppressed. The pronuba produced a small bundle wrapped in white linen. She unwrapped it with ceremonial precision, revealing locks of hair, brown, lustrous, carefully preserved. Hair that had belonged to Claudia before this moment, to the girl she had been before she became a wife. But hair was only the beginning. The bride must be severed from her father's household, Julia Sempronia continued. She must be cut away from her family's gods, from her childhood's protection, from everything that made her who she was. Only then can she be bound to her husband's household, to his gods, to his fate. This was the part that ancient sources mention only in fragments, in half-lines that scholars argue over, in references so oblique they might as well be deliberate obscurations. The ritus sanguinis domestici, the ritual of domestic blood. Marcus stepped closer to his bride. The blade gleamed. "Show me your hand," he commanded. Claudia extended her left hand, palm upward. It was small, delicate, marked with the calluses of a loom, for even wealthy girls learned to weave, learned the fundamental work of women's labor that held households together. In the lamplight, the lines of her palm looked like ancient roads, like the paths that destiny carves into flesh. Marcus placed the edge of the blade against her palm, just below the base of her thumb. The bronze was cold. The metal had been forged specifically for this purpose, consecrated in the temple of Vesta, blessed by priests who spoke words in a language older than Latin, older than Rome itself. The room held its breath. "With this cut," Marcus said, his voice steady, rehearsed, "I sever you from your father's protection. You are no longer Claudia of the Claudii. You are no longer child, no longer virgin, no longer whole unto yourself." He pressed down. The blade parted skin with a whisper. Blood welled, dark as wine, and ran down Claudia's palm in rivulets that followed the lines of fate and fortune. She didn't cry out. She had been told that to show pain was to shame her family, to suggest weakness, to imply that she was not ready for what marriage truly meant. The blood of childbirth, the pain of loss, the small deaths that every woman died in the service of family and state. The pronuba stepped forward with a ceramic bowl, ancient and cracked, its surface covered in symbols that predated Rome's alphabet. She caught the blood as it dripped from Claudia's hand. 3 drops, 4, 5. "The blood of severance," Julia Sempronia intoned. "The price of transition, the sacrifice that makes sacred." But the ritual wasn't finished. Marcus extended his own left hand. Without ceremony, without hesitation, he drew the blade across his own palm, cutting deep enough that blood flowed immediately, mixing with his bride's in the bowl below. The symbolism was ancient, obvious. 2 become 1. Separate bloodlines joined through literal mingling of blood. The marriage sealed not through words or law, but through shared wound, shared pain, shared sacrifice. "With this blood," Marcus said, "I bind you to my household gods. You are now Claudia of the Antoni. My wound is your wound. My blood is your blood. My fate is your fate." The guests watched in silence. Some faces showed approval. This was tradition, after all. This was the old way, the way their ancestors had married when Rome was young and hungry and brutal. But other faces showed disgust, or at least discomfort. Because by 186 BCE, Rome had grown sophisticated. It had conquered Greece and absorbed its philosophy, its art, its pretense of civilization. The Republic fancied itself enlightened, modern, advanced beyond such crude displays. Yet the old rituals persisted, especially among the most ancient families, the ones who remembered when Rome was nothing but wolves and shepherds, and the occasional fratricide. The pronuba lifted the bowl. now containing the mingled blood of husband and wife. She carried it to the small shrine in the corner of the atrium, the lararium, where the household gods resided, where the lares and penates watched over family fortune with wooden eyes and painted smiles. She poured the blood over the shrine's base. "Witness," she commanded the gods. "Witness, witness this sacrifice. Hold these two to their oaths, bind them through blood and pain, through wound and healing. Let no man separate what blood has joined." The blood soaked into the stone, disappearing as though the house itself drank it, hungry for the old offerings, the old ways. But there was more. There was always more. From the shadows, another figure emerged. An old woman, bent and twisted by age, her face so wrinkled it looked like crumpled papyrus. She was the Saga, the wise woman, the keeper of secrets that priests didn't want known. In her hands, she carried a bundle wrapped in black cloth. The room's temperature seemed to drop. The Saga approached Claudia, who stood with her hand still bleeding, crimson drops pattering on the mosaic floor, a floor that depicted scenes from mythology, Persephone's abduction by Hades, a reminder that marriage itself was a kind of underworld, a descent into darkness from which there was no return. "The bride must understand," the old woman croaked, her voice like stone scraping stone, "that marriage is death and rebirth. She dies to her old life. She must be mourned before she can be celebrated." She unwrapped the black bundle. Inside was a small clay figure, a doll, crudely made, with painted features that somehow captured Claudia's likeness. This was the pupa, the childhood doll that every Roman girl kept, the symbol of innocence and play. The Saga placed it on the floor. Marcus raised his foot and brought it down. The clay shattered with a sound like breaking bone. "The girl is dead," the old woman intoned. "The wife is born. Mourn what was. Embrace what must be." Claudia stared at the broken pieces of her childhood. Later, she would tell her daughters that this moment was when she truly understood what she had lost, what she would never recover. Not her virginity. That was merely flesh, merely function, but her selfhood, her autonomy, her right to exist as something other than wife, mother, property of her husband's household. The ceremony continued. They shared the sacred cake, panis farus, made from far, the ancient grain of Rome, the grain that predated wheat, that tasted like earth and history and all the weddings that had come before. Each took a piece, and as they chewed, they sealed the marriage in another way, through shared consumption, through incorporating the same substance into their bodies, becoming literally one flesh. But the taste was bitter. The grain had been mixed with wormwood and salt, flavors of preservation and bitterness, a reminder that marriage was not sweetness, not romance, not the pretty lies that poets told. Marriage was survival. Marriage was alliance. Marriage was the mechanism by which families endured and property transferred and bloodlines continued. When it was finished, when all the rituals had been observed, and all the blood had been shed, and all the words had been spoken, Marcus took his wife's wounded hand in his own wounded hand. They stood like that, palm to palm, blood mingling still, and for the first time he looked at her not as a political arrangement or a duty to his family, but as a person. A young woman who had just been severed from everything she knew, who had been cut and bound and broken and remade according to the specifications of tradition. "I will try," he said quietly, so quietly that only she could hear, "to make this worth the blood you've shed." It was not a promise of love. Romans didn't marry for love, but it was a promise of effort, of recognition, of the small kindness that sometimes emerged from duty. Claudia nodded. Her hand throbbed. The pain was sharp, immediate, real. Outside, the city continued its eternal roar. Vendors shouting prices, wheels clattering on stone, the distant bray of donkeys and the closer sounds of argument and laughter. Rome went on, indifferent to the small violence committed in its name, the blood shed in service of its social order, the young woman who had just learned that civilization was only ever a thin veneer over something much older, much darker, much more honest about what it demanded. The historical record is deliberately vague about the ritus sanguinis domestici. Mentions appear in fragments. A line from Plutarch, a dismissive comment in Varro's Antiquities, a scholar's footnote suggesting that certain families practiced blood rites that were later abandoned. By the imperial period, the ritual had vanished entirely, replaced by more civilized ceremonies that didn't require brides to bleed before they could wed. But the silence itself is telling. Because Rome excelled at forgetting its own violence, at transforming its brutal origins into noble myths, at sanitizing its history until it gleamed like marble, rather than running red like the stone beneath a sacrifice. The ritual served multiple functions, each more disturbing than the last. First, it was a demonstration of the bride's courage and endurance. A woman who couldn't bear a small knife wound certainly couldn't bear childbirth's greater violence. Second, it was a literal severance, cutting her away from her family's protective gods and binding her to her husband's household through blood magic, through the oldest form of contract, the one sealed in pain. Third, it reinforced the fundamental truth of Roman marriage, that wives were property, transferred from father to husband, their bodies and blood belonging first to one man, then to another, never to themselves. Modern scholars who mention the ritual at all tend to couch it in language that minimizes its horror. They call it symbolic, as though the blood wasn't real, as though the pain wasn't genuine, as though the psychological impact of being cut and bound and broken could be dismissed as mere metaphor. But Claudia Tercia's descendants preserved a different story. Whispered across generations of daughters, hidden in the margins of family records, carefully maintained despite the risk of seeming barbaric to their sophisticated neighbors. They remembered that marriage began with bloodshed. They remembered that civilization's foundation was violence. They remembered what their mothers taught them, that to be a woman in Rome meant learning to endure pain without flinching, to accept loss without mourning, to smile through wounds that never fully healed. The scar on Claudia's palm never faded. 40 years later, when she was a grandmother, when she had survived her husband's death and her son's political careers and her daughter's marriages, when she had endured plague and famine and civil war, all the catastrophes that life in Rome entailed, she would still trace the line across her palm with her finger, feeling the raised tissue, remembering the lamp smoke and the bronze blade, and the moment she stopped being one person and became another. "Does it still hurt?" her granddaughter once asked, taking the old woman's hand, examining the ancient scar. Claudia smiled. It was not a happy expression. "Every day," she said. "Every single day." But she had learned to live with pain. That was what the ritual taught, after all. That was its purpose, its hidden curriculum. Not just to bind a woman to her husband, but to prepare her for everything that came after. The pain of childbirth and the pain of loss, the pain of watching children die and the pain of surviving them. The slow accumulation of wounds that life inflicted on anyone who lived long enough to accumulate them. The blade was mercy in its way. It was honest. It told the truth that pretty wedding ceremonies obscured, that marriage was sacrifice, that union required severance, that to become something new required the destruction of what was old. Rome built an empire on such truths. Built it on blood and pain and the willingness to do what was necessary, however brutal, however disturbing, however much it cost in human suffering. The wedding ritual was just one small piece of that larger pattern, one small ceremony in a civilization built on ceremonies of violence, where every triumph was bought with blood, where every peace was negotiated through war, where every marriage began with a blade and a wound, and the understanding that love, if it came at all, would have to grow in soil fertilized by pain. They stopped performing the ritual eventually. Someone decided it was barbaric, uncivilized, unsuited to a sophisticated empire. The bronze blades were melted down, reforged into something useful. The ceramic bowls were broken, discarded, buried under new construction. The words were forgotten or deliberately suppressed, erased from official records, transformed into the kind of myth that scholars could dismiss. But the truth persisted, hidden in scars and whispered stories, preserved in the knowledge that no society entirely escapes its own violence, that civilization is always a performance, that beneath the marble and the law and the philosophy, there is always blood, always the blade, always the wound that never fully heals. This is what they don't teach you about ancient Rome. Not the triumphal arches or the aqueducts, not the Senate speeches or the military victories. They teach you glory and conquest, philosophy and law. They show you marble statues with their pristine white surfaces, never mentioning that Romans painted them in garish colors, that the pure classical aesthetic we admire was never pure at all. They don't show you the 16-year-old girl with blood running down her palm, standing in a smoke-filled room, learning the lesson that every Roman woman learned, that her body belonged to others, that her pain was necessary, that she must bleed before she could be bound. That is the ritual they hid from history. That is the ceremony they buried beneath centuries of sanitization and silence. That is the truth that ancient Rome didn't want you to know, that at its core, at its foundation, in its most intimate ceremonies, the empire ran red. And somewhere, in some quiet corner of your mind, you already knew this. You knew that civilizations don't rise without violence, that social order demands sacrifice, that every golden age is built on foundations of blood and pain. You knew. You just chose not to look too closely. Until now.